Everybody, a very warm welcome to today's webinar, Redefining Resolution. My name is David Liddle. I'm the CEO and the founder of the TCM Group, and it's absolutely fantastic to welcome so many of you here today to talk about a topic which I know is incredibly important to us. It's about how do we resolve differences, division, discord, disputes in a more constructive way. And wow, could this webinar not be more timely? What a night, what a morning, what a day. Today we've seen division, we've seen breakdown, we've seen disharmony, and we've seen the impact that that's playing in our country. I know many of us are thinking about it at the moment. Many of us may feel very distracted by it. For those of you who have joined the webinar today with just so much going on, I'm delighted you're here. And someone did email me earlier today saying this could not have come at a better time. And I genuinely believe that. The toxic and divisive nature of the EU referendum campaign set for me the kind of tone that we often see when we're in organisations, helping them think about how they resolve disputes and grievances. And for me, the grievance procedure and the traditional approaches within our organisations actually unconsciously and subconsciously encourage the kind of divisive, dogmatic, negative and destructive behaviour that I think we've all witnessed over the last 3 months. The end result of that, well, democracy has spoken, there's been a democratic process, but it's going to have a significant fallout for weeks, months, and indeed years to come. And when we're working with organisations, we see the same kind of fallout, and your employees are making decisions every day. Do I remain or do I leave? And as we see time and time again from the existing dispute resolution systems and approaches, good employees, hard-working employees, loyal employees are making the decision, I cannot stay in this organisation, I cannot work with this manager, I cannot be part of this team because of the way that we're resolving our disputes and grievances. The good news is more and more organisations are now waking up and recognising that we cannot continue dealing with this stuff in the old-fashioned way. And I say old-fashioned because the idea of writing it down, submitting a grievance to a higher authority, for some panel to be created and then make a determination feels to me to be antiquated, it's out of date, it's outmoded, it's disempowering, it's harmful and it's divisive. And organisations are starting to say enough is enough. We want to find a new way of resolving disputes where cooperation, collaboration, dialogue, empathy, listening, compassion and engagement are at the heart of that process. Now, of those words, those superlatives, those adjectives that I've just described to you, do they feature in our grievance procedure? How many of our grievance procedures talk about empathy? How many of our grievance procedures talk about compassion? How many of our grievance procedures are genuinely about dispute resolution, or are they more about dispute escalation and risk mitigation? And I would argue they're very much about the latter. They're not about the former. And in so doing, the grievance procedure in particular, in my view, is one of the most damaging and divisive and pernicious aspects of the modern organisation. But it sits on our internal employee relations system, on our intranet, collecting digital dust with no one sitting down and saying, what is this policy doing to our organisation? What kind of tone is it setting? What sort of message is it setting out? What sort of example is it setting for our employees, new and old, in terms of the kind of business we want to be? We're seeing more and more organisations, big organisations, and I'll be sharing with you some case studies from the likes of Lloyds Banking Group, from Royal Mail, from large hotels, from large councils, who are saying we need to find a new way of resolving our differences where we sit down in a room and we do something very powerful. We talk and we listen. And at the heart of effective dispute resolution is talking and listening. But as I'll be arguing today, it seems to me when I work with organisations for the first time, we do more to impede talking and listening than we do to actively encourage it. So as I said, my name's David Liddle. I've got a colleague with me here as well, Owen Bubbers. Owen, hi, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Hi everyone, great to have you on the call. Just to say, obviously a lot going on. I imagine a few of us are a little bit tired from staying up much tonight perhaps, but great to have you on the call. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you, Owen. And Owen's the head of our resolution team, an inspiring leader of mediators, mediator and trainer. And Owen, I'm hoping we can hear some of your stories and some of the evidence that you've been gathering of the need for change and the positive impact that mediation in particular and cooperative processes in general are having in organisations.
Absolutely, happy to share that with you.
Owen, fantastic. So the webinar will last for around 45 minutes. There's lots and lots of opportunity for questions. You should have in your console a questions box. Feel free to ask any questions you wish. We will try and answer those questions. This is an incredibly popular webinar. So as we've emailed you about, you may have seen that, we're going to carry the conversation on into Twitter. So if we don't get a chance to answer your questions, we will try and do so through Twitter. It's the first time we've done a live Q&A through Twitter. The hashtag is Redefining Resolution. If you'd like to ask Owen or I a question, simply put the question into Twitter, use that hashtag, and we'll pick that up, and we'll be doing a live Q&A for half an hour after the webinar. The webinar is being recorded, and it will be transcribed, and it will be put onto YouTube as well, so you can watch it again at your pleasure and at your leisure, and hopefully share it with others. There's a couple of polls through the webinar which we'll be asking, and this webinar precedes the launch of a major white paper next week called Redefining Resolution, and everyone on this webinar will be receiving a free copy of that. It's also building on a conference that TCM ran in February, again of the same name, Redefining Resolution. We had speakers from the ILM, from the CIPD, from various industry organisations, and others, talking about the importance of changing the way we resolve disputes. So look, it's a busy day, there's a lot going on, but please sit back, enjoy, and I genuinely hope that through today's webinar you gain some valuable insights into the fact that there are better ways of doing things than going into grievance. So a little bit about TCM. Many of you will have heard of us, no doubt. We are the market leaders in the area of mediation and dispute resolution in the UK. This webinar is part of our series of events for our 15-year birthday. We had our 15th anniversary party in our offices in Islington. Earlier this week, I ran a webinar on Wednesday launching a new franchising operation of the TCM Group and generating franchises across the UK and internationally. And our core services are around mediation, employee-industrial relations, anything in relation to helping people build dialogue and have collaborative and cooperative conversations when they're in dispute. We specialise in embedding mediation into organisations, often in complex organisations like Royal Mail, like Network Rail, like Lloyds Banking Group, like EDF Energy, like BT, like Transport for London, and many, many others, as well as large hospitals, councils and others. We specialise in helping managers and leaders to have the skills, develop the skills to resolve issues at source and nip them in the bud. I call it dragging soft skills into the 21st century. It's what we're doing. We're really actively promoting best practice for managers and leaders. And we also run the UK's flagship accredited mediator training, the National Certificate in Workplace Mediation. I know a number of you on this webinar may well have been through that programme, and we run that on a public basis and also on site for our customers. That's a little bit about TCM. I'm very proud that we've made it through 15 years. We've just been through one recession. Goodness knows what's going to happen now, but I'm sure we'll be okay. That's just some of the clients we work with. So what will we be looking at today? Well, why are more and more organisations removing their grievance procedure? Let's be honest, they're not removing their grievance procedure. They're wholesale shredding their grievance procedures. Why are they doing it? Why are they saying that enough is enough, we need to remove this and introduce a resolution policy? How is this being integrated, and particularly working with the triumvirate of HR, ER, IR, unions, managers? How is this working to bring those three key players together, human resources, managers and unions together? How are organisations demonstrating the need for mediation? We're seeing a much greater focus on the use of evidence to underpin the need, and we're also seeing a lot more work being done within organisations to gather evidence of the return on investment, or as I call it, the ROM, the return on mediation. How are organisations doing that? So we'll look at the role that key players are taking in terms of embedding a resolution process, and we'll look at the impact of this new approach within organisations, and we'll be showing some case studies today. But here we have our two parties. This picture says a lot about conflict. Passive aggressive, shouting, they're not listening. This is divisive, it's damaging, there's not a good communication. This is going badly wrong, and this is the kind of conversation that's happening in offices, depots, clinics, wards, shops, hotels across the country right now, today. And this is what happens. We move into a binary position. It's about who's right, who's wrong, who can prove their case. I don't trust you. Who do you think you are? You're a bully. It's all your fault. I win, you lose. And that is the nature of how we perceive justice in our organisations. It's about winners and losers. It's about balance of probability. It's about the Birchall test. It's about demonstrating we've investigated, we've handled it properly, we've followed a process. We followed a process. That seems to me to be what trumps the most important part of dispute resolution, common sense. We've followed a process. What about we've applied common sense? Common sense, trust and communication. When this stuff's going on in front of us, trust, communication, common sense do a flying leap out of the nearest open window. And for HR professionals, managers and leaders and others are starting to say, hang on, the process is important, procedural fairness is important, that the mechanisms for resolving disputes, yes, they're important, they safeguard the employee's rights, they ensure that we meet the minimum standards set out by the ACAS Code on Disciplinary Grievance, yes, they're important. But what about getting in a room and sorting the problem out? What about finding out what's going on at source? What about helping the parties to express their needs, goals and interests in a way which is meaningful, which drives an adult-to-adult conversation? And HR professionals and others are rightly saying the grievance procedure is woefully inadequate. Yes, it allows process to be followed. But is that enough? Is that okay? Is that the right way for us to resolve our disputes, to follow a process? And when we're talking about conflict, we see there's so much more to a conflict or a dispute. It's about our needs not being met. That gives rise to a profound sense of loss, a perceived loss or a fear of future loss. That's at the heart of the conflict. That then drives the 4 Fs, the fight, flight, freeze or fall. Of course, as mediators, we talk about the 5th F, flow. But when that flow isn't there, it impacts on how we act, interact and react, and that drives the destructive behaviours, and it's the destructive behaviours that our organisations are obsessed about. Proving or disproving or gathering evidence or corroboration. As a mediator, I want to help the parties talk about the impact of the behaviour and listen when the other person talks about intent. Intent and impact, 2 key variables in the conflict life cycle, but are often overlooked and not discussed. And when we help the parties start to think about intent and impact, then they can start to recognise that they have shared needs, to be respected, to be valued, to be heard, to be taken seriously. And so I would suggest that our existing dispute resolution systems, and I'm talking here in particular about grievance, but we could include performance management, absence management, we could include disciplinary processes and bullying and harassment procedures. They are reactive. You have to press a button, and it's often the nuclear button. They're intrinsically adversarial. They drive a wedge between people at the very time we should be getting them together. Okay, we might have a paragraph and we encourage informal resolution in our organisation. That's not enough. When we go into these processes, we know the relationship's never going to be the same again. We'll skip through informal resolution and get to stage 2 as quickly as we can. They polarise the party. Sorry, Owen.
Sorry, if I may, very quickly.
Of course.
It's a point I'd like to come on to. You talk about the challenge, why existing dispute resolution systems make adversarially difficult. I think we have a view in our culture that talking is weak, talking is cheap, and it can be. But I think for people who are in conflict, you talk about the importance of getting them in a room. That most simple of acts is actually people think as being weak, but we as mediators know that actually that's often the most courageous thing of all, is looking that person in the eye, the one person you cannot stand, and actually telling them how you feel and how, what the impact has been, because we know in procedural fairness and formal approaches isn't always a great time to share what the personal impact has been for us as human beings.
Yeah.
And also sharing that vulnerability of, this is what you've done to me, this is the loss that I felt. Incredibly hard to share. But if we never get these guys in a room, for me, it feels like there's not even a chance for them to share this stuff, and we know that's so important if they're ever going to find an equitable, collaborative way forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a number of things that puzzle me in the way that our organisations function. I think the first one is the perception that mediation and dialogue of the kind you're talking about, Owen, is seen as some kind of a soft option. It's not a soft option. You're sat around the other side of a table from someone describing to you very clearly, very coherently, very candidly, the impact of the behaviour and asking you to stop or change your behaviour, and for you to be able to really hear what they're saying. There's nowhere to run, there's nowhere to hide. For me, it's the toughest conversation. Slapping in a grievance and hoping that a panel will find in my favour is a complete abrogation of responsibility. It's a mirage that we will have some form of justice or says procedural fairness. Procedural fairness through grievance is a mirage. It's a falsehood. It's something we peddle, but we don't think about it. It's not that there's any untruths being told. We just haven't sat down and thought about the grievance procedure is institutionalizing abrogation of responsibility. But it's puzzling to me how we can see talking with each other as the soft option. It's absolutely not. For those of you who are out there as mediators, working as mediators, I hope you will be nodding frantically when I say this. When the parties are having an open and honest and frank conversation, it's probably the most difficult conversation that they'll ever have. The second thing that puzzles me is at the end of that mediation process, the parties turn around to us as mediators and say, why on earth, why did we not have this conversation earlier, and why did someone in our organisation in a position of responsibility not help us to get in a room and figure this out? And if I had a penny for every time I'd heard the parties say that and crying out for the organisation to think and react proactively to resolve their differences, I would be a very, very, very rich man.
One more quick thing, if I may, is that I think in these often with the best of intentions, people have a sense of, right, if I put that grievance in, I've got a chance of getting my day in court, a pound of flesh, and frankly, you know what, they deserve it given what they've done to me. And that's a very natural human response.
Yeah.
And that can be just somewhat honestly feels. But the reality is I think we're good at thinking about, what do I want? I think we're less good at working through what do I really need? What are Maslow's hierarchy of needs? What are the core needs that I really require in this situation? And the risk is that our processes don't support that honest search to really drill down under to the core of what do I need to be able to move on. And I think that the dialogue process is so important if we're ever going to get to that point.
Absolutely. What do I need? What do I need? It's such an important question. And this is what do we need in our organisations? What do we need right now? We need to have good management of resources. For those of you in an HR role, I know there's a lot of you from the HR community, think about the last settlement agreement, think about the last grievance process, think about the last employment tribunal. That is costing an enormous amount of money. It's not costing money, it's wasting money. It's money, good money, that's going down the drain. And I was talking to an HR director of an organisation where we set up a mediation programme, and he simply said to me, David, there was a mediation done the other day. It was complicated. It's been resolved, and that mediation has paid for the setting up, the training of the mediation team, and training for 200 managers in conflict management skills within the organisation. So one case that hadn't gone to an employment tribunal paid for a mediation capacity, all of the scheme being set up, and 200 managers being paid in conflict management skills. Yet organisations repeatedly will spend money on resolving these issues, often at the late stage, by unfortunately spending an awful lot of time and money at a point where so much could have been done at an earlier stage to be able to resolve the issue. So I'm going to launch the first of the polls this afternoon, and it's simply think critically about your existing grievance procedure as it stands. Is it effective at resolving disputes? Resolving is underlined. Is it effective at resolving disputes? I'm going to launch the poll now, so I'll be interested to hear what your thoughts are. So does it resolve disputes? The poll is now opened. So it's like a poll we've just had, a slightly different poll than the one we've just had, of course. Okay, so 80% of people on the webinar have voted. I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, one. Okay, we had 87% of attendees voted. 40% of you said yes, our grievance procedure is effective at resolving disputes, and 60% of you said no. That's very, very interesting. So the large proportion of people on the webinar saying no, it's not resolving disputes. For those of you who said yes, it is, I would love to hear what it is in your grievance procedure that's helping to drive resolution. So if you would be so kind as to share your thoughts through either the chat pane or through the questions pane. What is it in your grievance procedure? Oh, hang on, I can put the poll results up there. You can see the poll results now. What is it in your grievance procedure, if you said yes, that is working? What's creating the environment that disputes are being resolved? For the 60% of you who said no, then let's have a little look now at what might be available to you to help change the way that you resolve disputes in your organisation and maybe move away from the traditional grievance procedure. So thank you very much for participating in that poll. That's been very, very insightful. So the word to me is damaging. The word grievance, it's a horrible word. It's about formality and defensiveness. It's draconian. It's about win-lose. It's about grief. The word resolution, we work with organisations to create resolution policies. It's more informal. It's future focused. It just feels safer. It's about consensus. It's about win-win outcomes. It's about finding solutions. It's about mediation. For me, I remember a debate with a good friend of mine from the CIPD, Johnny Gifford, and he said to me, David, is this not just a bit of a rebrand on grievance procedures? Is this not language? I said, Johnny, conflict is all about language and how we receive it and how we perceive it. And if the grievance procedure, so we open up our employee handbook, it's our first day and our new employer, we're very excited. Welcome to your new employer. Welcome to your induction program. Here's your new employee handbook. Page 1, welcome to your new employer. It's great to have you on board. Page 2, how to take out a grievance against your manager. Page 3, how to sack you fairly. Page 4, how we'll manage your performance when you underperform. And if we look at this traditional employee handbook and the suite of HR policies, it sends out a very clear message of the kind of culture in the organisation through the language that we're using. And if we can change the vernacular in our organisations to become more needs and interest-based and more cooperative, then that creates the kind of culture that can permeate through our business, because we're sending out a clear message of the kind of organisation we are. Organisations increasingly are looking at measuring, are they ready for the change? So what is the cost of conflict? Does it feature as a strategic priority? People often say to me, David, managers and leaders, they should be dealing with this. And I say, well, how can it be an operational priority? When I go to the board and I have a 15-minute presentation at the board, I give them the evidence of an audit we've run, and the board will say to me, but David, we don't have a problem with bullying and conflict in our workplace. And I'll be like, well, your employees are saying you do. It may not be coming up through grievance, but there might be issues around exit interviews and other forms of data. And the board often are in denial about a problem that's existing within their organisation, yet they expect operational managers to resolve these issues. And of course, from an HR perspective, we may have the Ulrich model, we may have cascaded and delegated some of these responsibilities down the line. But when the line look at the board level, they're seeing a lack of a strategic priority. So why would it be an operational priority? There's a mismatch. And I think first thing is recognizing that conflict is a natural expression of any organization, and it needs to feature as a strategic priority as well as a line management operational priority. And in my view, HR are well positioned to drive those two. And I think it's an important role that HR can be playing. Looking at the cost of... Oh, sorry, Owen, go ahead.
Very briefly, just, it's interesting, the last few weeks, you and I have been working together with several organisations on really kind of complex meaty kind of OT projects. And sort of a reflection I have is I'd say that for every organisation, and feel free to set a review of this, but my view is for every organisation that I work with, looking at trying to evaluate the cost of conflict in terms of resources, time spent, sickness, absence, you name it. For every organisation that has really great data that they can just draw on very easily to help us carry that evaluation process. There are many more organisations where essentially you have the Excel spreadsheet and you have your titles of what your factor indicators should be, and there's precious little of any data. And it's just striking, 21st century, an organisation has a strategy, policy seemingly for everything. When it comes to actually having the tools to really evaluate the cost of this to the organisation, which can run into the hundreds of thousands and millions of pounds per year, it's remarkable that more organisations do not prioritise this. I think what you're saying, absolutely right. It's got to be a strategic priority if it's ever going to be an operational priority.
Absolutely, Owen, absolutely. Now, if anyone's interested in gathering evidence of the cost of conflict, we have a resolution audit, and I'm very happy to share that with you and support you in gathering the evidence. So please email me after the webinar or send me a message through LinkedIn or through Twitter, and I'm happy to share with you more details about how organisations like Royal Mail, like Lloyds, like others are using evidence to drive change within their organisations. So let me introduce you to the resolution policy, and we'll share this with anyone who hasn't had it yet, and you'll also get a free copy of the white paper called Redefining Resolution, which will have a number of toolkits in it as well as case studies. The first thing I would suggest an organisation does with its grievance procedure is shred it. The most valuable thing a grievance procedure can do is to provide bedding for soft, small, furry animals. So if you have a pet at home, the grievance procedure is incredibly valuable for that. I don't have an awful lot of a view in terms of the additional value of a grievance procedure. My experience is when people go through it, they feel aggrieved, upset. It makes matters worse, as I've already said. So let's just take the step. I remember at the Law Society when I launched my procedure, I shredded it. Now, don't tell anyone. It was that I didn't actually have a grievance procedure. I shredded the Law Society's fire escape plan. But nonetheless, it sent out a message. And I remember there being gasps. But now more and more HR professionals are saying, do you know something, David? It's right. Let's get rid of this procedure. What I'd like to do now is just play a short video of an organisation who've begun to make that change and who are starting to see a value in making a change to the way that they've resolved disputes within their organisation. And I'm talking here in particular about the Lloyds Banking Group. So I'm just going to play a short video from Lloyds. So hopefully you should be able to see this.
So we've been working with TCM for a little over 4 years now, developing our mediation strategy, which is now what we term to be issue resolution. So what we've done is work really hard with David and the team to develop that professional mediation expertise within the organisation, and that expertise sits in my team. And we've used that expertise to make tangible differences in terms of the way we manage conflicts in the organisation. So what that's helped us to do is think very differently about resolving issues informally rather than rely on formal processes to help us to do that. Certainly in terms of results, we've seen our harassment numbers pretty much halve in the time that we've been doing what we've been doing from an issue resolution perspective. Our grievance numbers are down. We are still working really hard to create an issue resolution policy framework rather than have that reliance on grievance as a policy. If I look at what we've saved the organisation from a financial perspective, when we assess the cost and time of mediation versus formal grievance and harassment, you know, that is in the millions already. And the case is compelling for us to continue on the journey. We've still lots to do, but I think we've come quite some way. When you look at having a grievance policy in comparison to issue resolution, what you've got invariably is formal, protracted processes that ultimately
just bear with me
while do anything to restore working relationships, whereas issue resolution is absolutely about doing that and making sure that you can do that bit for engaging with the workforce. Mediation, for me, absolutely recommend that to other companies because that's what restores relationships, that's what allows companies to prosper.
Okay, so that's a short vox pop from Lloyds Bank, from Sue Higson and the team at Lloyds Banking Group, who've seen a significant impact as a result of making these changes and have driven savings, as she cited there, in terms of millions of pounds. And that's an example from a great many organisations across the UK who are starting to see significant impact and significant benefits to their organisations. The CIPD are supportive. They're saying, look, we think mediation should be being used. It shouldn't be being used in isolation, which we'd completely agree. But it needs to be part of the way the organisation works. It's less harrowing and less time consuming. And Johnny Gifford from the CIPD and others within the CIPD are actively promoting an alternative way of thinking about grievance. And what's critical here, and it's important for HR professionals to recognise this from the CIPD, is it doesn't have to be called a grievance procedure. ACAS are saying it doesn't have to be called a grievance procedure. The CIPD is saying it doesn't have to be called a grievance procedure. As long as we meet the minimum standards set out from the ACAS Code on Discipline and Grievance, which are basically to give people a chance to meet with the employer and also to have the right to representation and to have the right to appeal, which are minimum standards you would expect in any organisation. As long as those are in place, then that's what's key. And what the TUC, I think, is absolutely fascinating here. It's about trust. There needs to be a sense of trust between all parties. Kathy Brown from Engage for Success, and I've heard Nita Clark and David McLeod speak. I've spoken at conferences with them. So if we think about employee engagement, mistrust is the antithesis of an engaged, happy, healthy workforce. And what the TUC is saying here, Kevin Rowan, head of organisation and services, is it's about trust. But as I mentioned, when we get into the dispute, trust is one of the first things that breaks down. Mediation, as Kevin rightly saying, as the CIPD rightly saying, is key to rebuilding that trust. So what's different about the approach? Well, it's very different in some respects, and it's basically common sense in others. It's about putting empathy into our organisation systems and processes and institutionalising empathy, the ability to put ourselves in the other person's shoes. And the first thing I would say, if you're looking at your grievance procedure or rewriting your grievance procedure or wanting to review your grievance procedure, is to undertake an empathy audit and ask yourselves critically, does this policy encourage people to take a polarized view, or does it encourage them to take an empathetic view? And empathy is at the heart of rebuilding communication and rebuilding trust, putting ourselves into the other person's shoes. So the resolution policy offers a new approach. It's values-based and person-centred. It encourages an enhanced role for triage of cases. When we were training the Lloyds Bank mediation team, or setting up the Lloyds Bank scheme, or in Islington or Royal Mail, the first thing we do is we train HR professionals to spot issues at a much earlier stage, and that they'll triage those cases and identify the most effective route to resolution, which is primarily mediation. So it's focusing on, and of course for the HR role and the manager's role, is how do we get the parties to subscribe to mediation when they probably don't want to sit in a room with the other person. It's key part of the resolution approach, is securing an early commitment to what is a difficult conversation. It also includes toolkits for HR professionals, for managers, leaders, and for employees. So it's not just a policy of I followed steps 1, 2 and 3, therefore we're not going to be at risk at an employment tribunal of acted improperly. We have actually and actively and proactively encouraged the parties to resolve their differences. So it's
just a quick thought there on the HR.
Go ahead, of course, Owen.
Just working with the organisation at the moment, really interesting. And I've just finished delivering a training course for new mediators with 30 managers from across several NHS trusts around London. It's a fantastic experience. And what you realise is when you're trying to implement that whole systems approach to resolving conflict and redefining resolution, it's so important, as David said, that you empower HR, your HR staff at Triumvirate. It's so important. You give them the tools, because the reality is, my view is, I've worked with lots of HR professionals, is the mindset tends to be, with the best of intentions, you bring me the problem and I'll fix it for you. I have a process, I have a problem-solving approach, and that's excellent. It's simply, though, when we move on to triaging cases that involve that intensive judgment, it's informal. You haven't necessarily got a policy to work everything out. It's a little bit more grey, if you will. That sense of confidence and that ability to make that decision, it can go against muscle memory quite a lot. So I think triaging, empowering your HR force, so important if you're going to successfully implement mediation within the culture of the organisation.
Absolutely right. And I think it's also fair to say this isn't about blaming anyone in the organisation for this. Many organisations have inherited this. We saw the disciplinary process emerging in the sort of 1970s, the formal grievance processes emerging in the 90s. And many HR professionals have inherited the grievance procedure and have worked, in essence, dealt with the hand that you've been dealt. What I'm suggesting here and what organisations are saying is, hang on, we've been dealt this hand, but is it the best hand for our business? And it's not saying that, in essence, the HR function or leadership or other functions have been negligent or acting improperly by having this process. It's about encouraging a dispute, a dialogue about disputes and a conversation about conflict, which can then drive change within our organisations. And no other part of our organisation would be subject to so little review and evaluation, yet have such a profound impact on people's lives. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, I haven't had a grievance in my organisation for 10 years. Some of you may have had 10 grievances in your organisation in the last 10 days. No organisations are the same. But what my experience is people are often scared to go into grievance. They're afraid of going into grievance. They work underneath the grievance procedure. They try and avoid dealing with it. Or you have a grievance culture where almost people are trigger happy and constantly going into them. Whatever it is, my experience is whether we go into it or we avoid going into it, it's not driving the kind of behaviour where leaders and managers can walk the talk and drive that cooperative and collaborative approach. So the approach draws on 5 core values, and when we rewrite grievance procedures or resolution policies for organisations, we often start with the values in mind. And it creates a very, rather than saying, we follow the ACAS code on discipline and grievance, please click here to read it on the ACAS website, starting what our organisation has clearly defined values. Thank you for joining our organisation. We recognise problems will occur. This approach is about fairness. It's about driving mutual respect. It's about creating empathy. It's about having a dignified conversation, a difficult conversation, and developing dialogue. And if the opening paragraph in our dispute resolution procedure, resolution policy, grievance policy is about values, again, it changes the mindset. Rather than it being a statutory or quasi-legalistic instrument, it drives, it changes that mindset. So what does it actually look like? Well, of course, every policy needs to have a flow chart. So we have a flow chart. It's a very simple flow chart. The issue is raised. So in Lloyds, as Sue was saying, there'll be a request for resolution raised. It will either go to early resolution, a meeting with the manager. HR might undertake a facilitated conversation. We do a lot of training for people in facilitated conversations because it's a really important conversation. Or it might go to an external mediator. Always should be accredited by the Professional Mediators Association, the standard for mediators in the UK. Or there'll be a formal resolution process, an investigation establishing the facts. But there'd always be a right and a responsibility to refocus on restoring relationships. And of course, if there's a meeting with the employee, they'd have the right to representation and ultimately the right to appeal. So we're meeting the minimum standards set out by ACAS, but it's at the end of the policy, not at the beginning of the policy. It's not about escalation, it's about resolution. And these are the roles that key players play. Well, of course, Jose Mourinho was in the news recently with the Chelsea doctor case, so it seems pretty pertinent because he's held up as a really good manager, and of course he's now at Manchester United. Yet managers really struggle sometimes to have those difficult conversations. So on one hand, a really strong, charismatic, well-respected and well-liked manager. On the other hand, being in the gaze of the media at the employment tribunal, settling a case for what could only be assumed to be in the millions of pounds. This is the kind of challenge our managers and leaders are facing right now. So employees and their representatives, human resources managers and leaders, it's not that there's negligence. It's not that these 3 key players aren't concerned about resolving issues. They absolutely are. But it's about they're all pulling in different directions. And the resolution policy brings these 3 stakeholders together, the triumvirate, the holy trinity, or sometimes I might think of them as the unholy trinity, but bringing them together to work together, cooperating to drive a culture of resolution and dialogue within the organisation. Again, if you've got any questions, please do feel free to ask questions for Owen and myself. We're very happy to answer any questions. So there's different resolution approaches, neutral evaluations, facilitated conversations, mediation, team building, coaching, and of course the formal resolution stages I've mentioned. And we help organisations embed these conflict management tools within their organisations through training and support. And that's what a mediation process looks like. A number of you may be familiar with mediation, but the mediator meets the parties separately to hear the issues and brings them together in a safe space. And that I've underlined the word safe space because that safety is absolutely vital to allow the parties to have an open and honest conversation. In Royal Mail Group, in the first 6 months of us running their bullying and harassment mediation program, 100% of cases that were mediated went to reach a successful outcome. As an organisation, well over 90% of cases that come to us are successfully resolved, and that level of success is replicated in organisations up and down the country. It's a highly effective remedy. if we can get the parties to the table, and that's key.
And I just say as a mediator who's doing a lot of cases at the moment, just briefly, people often, training mediators often ask us, they say, but what if you can't get the parties in the room? To which you'll say, well, no one wants to come to mediation. No one dreams of coming to mediation. It's not the easiest of process to take part in. And I think that, you've got to overcome those objections, but that's part of the deal. So, we call it the golden grunt. People have to be overjoyed to come to mediation. They have to be willing to give it a go. And if they are, they can walk through that door, and that's the start of the process. So I think that kind of sense of safety, it's a voluntary process. They have to make that call for themselves as an adult, so they can engage in that adult-to-adult conversation. That's what we're aiming for.
Absolutely. I mean, there's two lovely noises we love hearing in mediation. There's a, that's the golden grunt. I'll give it a go. I'll give it a go. The golden grunt. That's fantastic. And then, I didn't realise that's what you meant when you said I was a waste of space. I didn't realise that you were having difficulties in your life. I didn't understand the challenges that you were experiencing. I didn't recognise that when I did this, it would have that impact upon you. And two of the most magnificent noises we can hear as peacemakers in organisations, and we, these are really important to us, and helping people get to that particular point. Sorry for those sound effects. That was probably really terrible to hear, but they are very important to us as mediators and to the parties too. It's about building a commitment and generating awareness. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to say. Building a commitment and generating awareness.
Drop in a quick story, if I may, David. Do we have 30 seconds for that?
Yeah, go ahead, Owen. Absolutely.
You know what, you're just talking, it just came straight to me. So imagine yourself, if you will, you're sitting, if you've mediated before, you'll know this well, sitting down with two people, you've brought them together, you've had the morning working with them individually to understand what they're needing, help them to work through actually what are the core issues for them, their needs, they want to get out of the day, and then you bring them together in the afternoon. I'll never forget, it was been an educationalist with two individuals, a line manager, direct report. They've been in conflict for 5 years, and they gradually work their way through, I think, every kind of a grievance disciplinary procedure that the institution had to offer. Time off for sickness, absence, lack of communication, lack of contact, no appraisal process. 5 years, and it was clear that this had taken such a great toll on these individuals. And you know what? About 3:30 in the afternoon, I'm thinking we've got a long way to go here. They're sort of missing each other. And you know what? One person, the direct report, comes out and starts talking about an event that they put on a few years ago that really was one of the biggest things they'd ever done in their career. Took a huge amount of work, was incredibly personal to them, and really formed part of their identity of how they saw themselves as a professional in their field, as an expert. And the direct report said to the manager, they said, you know what? You knew how important this was to me, and you never even came. You never even bothered to respond to my invitation. And you know what? There's silence there. 30 seconds goes by or so, that deafening silence, and the line manager comes back and says, not only did I come along, I brought my students along, I waited 3 hours in the traffic on a Saturday afternoon to come along, I wrote in the guest book of the exhibition to thank you for everything you've done. Silence. The penny finally drops after 3 or 4 years, and you look. And you realise the weight, the burden that this person has carried around, the sense of injustice, the sense of betrayal, the sense of abandonment, all for nothing. And I would argue all for a lack of a supported conversation years ago that meant they would never have had to carry that around with them all that time, and which was still gnawing away at them even 3 or 4 years later.
Or 30 or 40 years later it can go on. And I think it's a really important point. Eleni, thank you for your question. You asked, what can managers do to prevent grievances happening? Well, let's come to that in a moment, because it's absolutely key. The first thing to do is to take our heads out of the sand, stop pretending it isn't happening, and go and have a conversation with people. And if you go and give someone a jolly good listening to, they will thank you. They will say, thank you for hearing what I'm saying. I'm not saying you have to agree with them. I'm not saying you have to take on board everything that they're saying. Just listen to what they're saying and try and put yourself in their shoes. And that is at the heart of dialogue building and problem solving. And we're so fearful of the organisational bogeyman coming and getting us, the F word of the modern business. Feelings. We're so scared of feelings. We're so scared of how people might react and the emotions that might come out. It impedes us having that most basic of conversations to tell me what's going on and giving them a good listening to. And that is about helping people resolve their issues. And that's what managers can be doing. And in essence, the grievance procedure impedes your managers having these conversations. It's a barrier. It's a block. It prevents people because they're fearful of having a grievance slapped against them. It's easier to say nothing. You cannot take a grievance out against someone for doing nothing. And that, I think, is where managers get it so wrong. And it's not that they're at fault, is they are working within the system that's been created. We generate the behaviours that we deserve as organisations. And this is why I'm calling for HR, for managers, for unions to think differently, because it's not that managers are being negligent, it's they're doing what anyone would do, which is just pretend it's not going on. And I think managers, Elena, you're saying you agree. I think I really appreciate that. Sometimes it is hard to hear criticism, and to remain non-defensive, but it can be done. And we train managers to respond non-defensively, and it's not impossible. You know, we don't have to have battle lines drawn. So in the white paper I'll be publishing, this is just some of the snippets from the white paper. We're coming to the end of the session now. So these are just some snippets. So Lancaster London, what a wonderful organisation to work with. And I've got such a lot of time and respect for the HR team within the Lancaster London. Of course, Harriet at the moment is working as the HR manager within the organisation. She's been an absolute pleasure to work with, and that organisation has embraced mediation, and Harriet's talked passionately about the role that mediation's playing in helping that organisation to be a best company to work for, but also a 5-star hotel over in West London. Islington Council, we've embedded a mediation programme there. They've talked again passionately about the role of safety, informal approaches, dialogue. And I think Pat sets out clearly in her case studies, you'll see, that resolution just wasn't a priority. It wasn't being resolved. There was a real dissatisfaction across the council. And that resonates in councils and organisations and hospitals that we work with. It's not just specific to Islington Council. What separates Islington Council or Kent Council or many of the others we've worked with is they've stepped up and done something differently about it. Arcadia Group, obviously they've been in the news a lot recently, the BHS and Sir Philip Green stuff that's been going on, but we've had a real pleasure working with Arcadia Group and helping them to adopt a more effective and efficient route for resolving disputes within their organisation. And this is, again, it's been an absolute pleasure to be working with them to help them think differently about their approach to dispute resolution within their business. So finally then, before we close the session off, is the final poll is, if I can find the poll, is to ask, would you, on the balance of what you've heard, right, so second poll is, would you consider introducing a mediation programme in your, would you consider developing a model resolution policy for your organisation? So apologies, there's just a slight technical glitch. So based on what you've heard this afternoon is, would you consider developing a resolution policy within your organisation? Conscious that we're coming to the end of the session, but the final of the polls, no more polls hopefully now. We've had one last night, 2 today. I think we're all polled out, but 65% voted. I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I think you're going to be very interested in the results. That tells us its own story. That's fantastic. That is absolutely fantastic. Well, look, we would love to work with the 93% of you who said that you would be interested. For those of you who not, I'm really interested to hear why not. You know, it's not right for every organisation, and I realise it's not something that would necessarily fit into every organisation. I'd love for you to share, perhaps through the Q&A that we're about to have on Twitter, you know, what are you doing in your organisation to resolve disputes? And for those of you who don't feel resolution's the right way forward, you know, in essence, why not? And what can we learn from your organisations to help us to be better at resolving disputes? So TCM is a fantastic little business. We're based in Islington. We provide professional mediation services. If there's a dispute on your desk right now and it's causing you a headache, it's causing you heartache, it's costing you money, give us a call. We can help resolve it. We set up mediation schemes like Royal Mail and Northumbria Healthcare Trust, a big piece of research that was done by ACAS. We provide the flagship mediation training course, and you'll be amazed how little it costs to train mediators, really amazed. So if you're interested in developing a mediation pool from one person to larger cohorts of mediators, please give us a ring. We do conflict audits and diagnostics. We love doing the evidence-based stuff. And of course, as I've mentioned already, we train managers and leaders in our Leaders 2020 program, a really fantastic program of dispute resolution, leadership and management effectiveness, and key skills around listening. All of the stuff, Eleni, that you were asking about managers, it's embedded in those approaches: listening, negotiation, influencing, and resolving difficulties. So we have a series of brochures. They're on our website. We'll send these through to you as well. This provides all the information you could need about our organisation. Oh, I'll just put that up. So this is what we can offer to you, various brochures and guides to our services. And for now, I'd like to ask if there's any further questions. Like I said, we'll go on to Twitter. So if you have got any questions for Owen or I, please do use the hashtag Redefining Resolution and just put your question in. Obviously, it needs to be brief because Twitter doesn't allow more than 140 characters, but we'll pick up the gist. If you don't want to do it through Twitter, or if you've got to go and do other things now, then please do email us any questions or any thoughts, or anything at all. And if we can be any support to you at all in any way, please just let us know. So thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Owen, for sharing your stories and your experiences. I'd like to wish you a very happy weekend, and let's hope that we're able to resolve any future divisions and difficulties in this country and also in our organisations in a very collaborative, supportive and compassionate way. So to all of you, happy mediating, and thank you very much for joining today's webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.